Hello, everybody. Welcome to the BQ Report. Um, Today, I'm just going to review the book by Friedrich Nietzsche titled Beyond Good and Evil. It's going to be a quick review, around 10 minutes or so, maybe longer than that. We'll see how this plays out. But I read this book back when I was, I'd say, 20 years old. I'm currently 21. I read that book when I was taking a philosophy class at Michigan State, and the professor gave me this book uh, by Friedrich Nietzsche. It's called Beyond Good and Evil, and I had a blast reading. Actually read it twice, um, and it's such an amazing book. So I'd like to review it and talk about what Friedrich Nietzsche was kind of saying with the affirmation of life and the Philosopher's Stone and what he says with regard to religion, scholars, and so many different avenues that he just talks about. It's amazing. His philosophy kind of reminds me of Arthur Schopenhauer a little bit, but it's a little different because Nietzsche kind of talks through a lens of he's speaking directly to the person rather than speaking on matters of public discourse. He's more of like speaking directly to the person that he's referring to in the book. So it's really interesting to like listen to like the sentences that he writes. Each sentence, I'm quoting Jordan Peterson here, but each sentence is like a bomb. When he writes a sentence, it's the most complex, complicated, and articulate sentence you could ever think of. And he just speaks on matters of morality, good and evil, thinking out of bounds, thinking out of the box, passing boundaries, and just so many interesting aspects. My favorite chapter is chapter 5, and it's just such an amazing. I can't stop praising this book. It's such a good book. I've also read like more books from Friedrich Nietzsche, like The Genealogy of Morality. That's a great book too. I've also read what else have I read by Friedrich Nietzsche? I've also read The Gay Science. That's a great book too. But Beyond Good and Evil is by far his best book out of all those amazing books that he has written. Simply because the average reader can kind of understand it based on like the words that he uses. And it's not like too complicated to kind of get through the book as some of his other ones are. Those are more streamlined books, where this is more of like a poetic, articulate, and authentic book where he kind of writes more of like prose fiction type novels, type sentences, and he kind of he dives very deep into religious, things, and and he and it's just like being like written in the 18th century, I believe, and he wrote this in like 1880s or something like that. It's just so cool to like think about like what was the train of thought going through his mind during that time period. It must have been terrible. This is pre World War One, pre World War Two, before the plague. He noticed these religious kind of faults and fallacies that with philosophy, and there was a contradiction there. So he kind of mentions that science is sort of the cure to this religious dogma that everybody has been following thus far in the world, and he criticizes that, and he makes sure to criticize the fact that many like priests and deacons and religious political figures kind of point to religion as the main focal point for purpose, when in reality the main purpose should be about truth and figuring out the truth and how that influences the way of life that everybody currently lives. And so I think that's what he was kind of trying to get at, is that truth is the ultimate reality. But even so, going past truth, truth is now becoming an obsolete value to strive for. He kind of mentions more values especially towards the end of the book, when I love how the last paragraph he says, my evil thoughts. these are all his evil thoughts, that he thinks of, presumably when he's alone or talking to Wagner, which is his friend, that I think lived with him at the time. And, after he was a professor and after, he kind of like downgraded with his health, and sickness became worse and worse and worse. And so he started writing a lot. And this was one of his books that he wrote that was like one of the ultimate amazing philosophical readings that many people consider to be like one of the greatest philosophies of all time. And so Beyond Good and Evil is, I think, like many of his other books I read, like for example, The Genealogy of Morals, is a scholarly book, and it's a very interesting read too. And that book has some very great lines and poetic, visionary things in it. And I do admire the way that he speaks on religion in that book too, and morality in general, philosophy, and everything like that. On that specific book, he speaks on it differently here in Beyond Good and Evil, because in this book, he's not thinking about how do I sound like a good, confident figure. How do I write a book that can get people to like me? He's not trying to be liked. The only thing that he's doing with writing Beyond Good and Evil, in my opinion, is he's simply trying to get the reader to expand their mind on values, a priori structures, and various assumptions and preconceived notions that many people have with philosophy, science, religion, and poetic visions. And he kind of criticizes previous philosophers that were kind of very underneath him. He thinks that, many, like, for example, I'm trying to think of who he criticized. Augustine, that's the one. He criticized Augustine for being so attached to this idea of good, and so attached to this notion of free will and virtue. And although he mentions virtue, Nietzsche mentions virtue in this book too. What he talks about is slave morality versus master morality and how those two differ. And I can explain the difference between the two, but I think you guys get the difference. So, there is a difference between multiple moralities. So he kind of dives into that philosophical question, and it's so interesting to figure that out. So overall, Beyond Good and Evil, I would give that, if I had to rate that book on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd give that book a 9 out of 10 for structure, content-wise, and just overall interest. So, and I'd give probably his other books 7 or 8s. But yeah, that's what I think about Friedrich Nietzsche's books so far. I'm gonna keep reading Friedrich Nietzsche, but like for now, I'm on The Promised Land. I'm gonna finish The Promised Land and give a review of that book, because that's very interesting too. But it's 700 pages long, so it's gonna be a while until I review that book. But anyways, I'm gonna do more book reviews in the future. So thank you guys for listening. Have a great day.